Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into a massive structural shift that completely rewired global history. We're going to explore how international politics transformed from a flexible, rule-bound system into a rigid, incredibly high-stakes standoff. You know, if you've ever wondered why modern global conflicts feel so absolute, so zero-sum, the answers actually lie in a profound mechanical breakdown of the traditional world order. Let's get right into it.
It's really fascinating to think about what happens to diplomacy when the world just runs out of room to expand. It forces superpowers into a terrifyingly direct confrontation. We're talking about a transition from an era where war was just a tactical maneuver handled by a few professionals, to an era where the absolute survival of entire populations is suddenly on the line.
Act 1, the classical chessboard fades. To really wrap our heads around our modern reality, we first have to look backward at a period defined by flexibility and shifting alliances.
The sheer math of this timeline is honestly staggering. Back in 1648, the German Empire alone was composed of 900 sovereign states. 900! By 1815, after the Napoleonic interventions, that consolidated way down to just 36 states. Fast forward to the aftermath of the Second World War, and we're left with a global stage dominated by exactly two superpowers. It beautifully demonstrates how the classical balance of power slowly but surely lost its vital flexibility over time.
Now, think about the contrast in how the game used to be played. In former times, having a multitude of active players, specifically 6 to 8 great powers of roughly similar magnitude, created this healthy, fluid uncertainty. You could never be entirely sure who would ally with whom. And that unreliability, it actually restrained nations from reckless power grabs. If you pushed too far, an unexpected coalition would just form to push you right back. But that crucial safety net completely vanished by the mid-20th century. Utter rigidity took over.
Act 2, the rise of nationalistic universalism. As the physical chessboard shrank, the psychological game mutated into a much more dangerous force.
You see, traditional nationalism of the 19th century basically just wanted self-determination. It left plenty of room on the map for many other nationalisms to exist peacefully side by side. But modern nationalistic universalism is an entirely different beast. It demands total ideological dominance. It claims for one nation and one state the absolute right to impose its own valuations and standards of action upon the entire globe. These rival claims to universal dominion dealt a totally fatal blow to the shared values that had kept international society functioning for nearly 3 centuries. Nations weren't just fighting over borders anymore, they were fighting over the ultimate nature of reality. Beneath the ruins of that shared moral roof, the old balance of power was effectively buried for good.
Act 3, disappearance of the balancer. Okay, so how did the physical mechanics of this power struggle actually change on the ground?
Think of the 18th century world like a carefully balanced scale, with a detached Great Britain acting as the monkey in the middle, keeping the massive houses of Bourbon and Habsburg in check. But by the mid-20th century, that scale is anchored by just two massive weights, the US and the USSR. The detached balancer has completely disappeared from the mechanism.
So why did this happen? Well, Great Britain could no longer play the impartial mediator because of some massive technological and geographic shifts. First off, they were vastly surpassed in naval strength by the United States. Second, modern instruments of warfare, like air power and mechanization, completely stripped away the historic geographic invulnerability of the British Isles. Suddenly, having a high concentration of population and industry squeezed into a small island territory so close to the continent, that became a massive liability, not an advantage. It all boils down to this. Centuries of complex, fluid diplomacy involving dozens of nations were brutally whittled down to a rigid system. Exactly 2 gigantic power blocks. That's it! Between 1870 and 1914, the main issues of world politics were essentially pushed outward, straight to the colonial periphery. The great powers expanded into the vast, politically empty spaces of Africa and Asia. This gave them room to compete, to trade, and even to clash without triggering a direct existential conflict back home in Europe. There was breathing room. There was room to maneuver.
But once those colonial frontiers vanish and the map totally filled up, those widespread conflicts aggressively centralized. The lines of tension snapped tightly back to the center, creating a terrifying bipolar standoff across the Atlantic and the Eurasian landmass.
With the empty spaces of the world completely filled, The finesse, the sidestepping, and the subtle maneuvering of classical diplomacy were replaced by a desperate face-to-face clash. As the source perfectly states, neither side can afford to compromise, and neither side has any room to retreat. They're locked in.
Act 4, the age of total war. Because the stakes were now absolute, the methods of waging conflict had to match that exact intensity.
So, what does total war actually entail in practice? The character of war fundamentally transformed from a limited, tactical game into an all-consuming effort in 4 distinct ways. First, the entire population identifies emotionally and ideologically with the conflict. Second, a massive fraction of people actually participates, either in uniform or working in factories. Third, the whole population is physically affected by bombings or economic strain. And fourth, the ultimate objective of the war is no longer a simple border adjustment. It's absolute victory.
Consider the contrast here. Back in the 14th to 18th centuries, warfare was fought by small bands of mercenaries. These soldiers were an investment. They were driven by profit. They actually actively avoided decisive bloody battles because, well, you can't spend your gold if you're dead. But 20th century warfare flipped this completely on its head. It relies on massive armies of conscripted citizens driven by ideology. This introduces a highly dangerous pseudo-religious fervor, creating a nation in arms willing to suffer and inflict total annihilation.
War was no longer seen as just a continuation of polite diplomacy. As Marshall Fox so grimly noted, the aim of modern war isn't to bring the enemy to the negotiating table. The aim is to utterly shatter the enemy's ability to resist or even to exist. You destroy their very means of discussion. It's the primitive spectacle of 2 giants where one absolutely must conquer or be conquered.
As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to ask ourselves a vital question. We've seen how the flexible, multiplayer chessboard was replaced by a rigid, high-stakes standoff driven by universal ideologies and the heavy machinery of total war. Looking forward, can the mechanisms of the past ever hope to manage the absolute stakes of the present? Can a true balance of power exist when the players are playing for all or nothing? It's a question that absolutely continues to define our world today. Thanks so much for joining me.